Hello and welcome to today's session on professional relationships. Today we have two speakers with us. They're going to be speaking back to back. The first speaker, and at the end there will be time for you to answer questions or to both of them. Please ask your questions using the online app if you can. We will have a microphone available for individuals who, if the app's not working and you need to ask it kind of in person, that's absolutely fine as well. We're starting with Sonny Hallett, who is an autistic counsellor and trainer, and they're also co-founder of AMAZE, which is the Autistic Mutual Aid Society of Edinburgh. Sonny will be talking about counselling for different ways of being. Okay, so over to you, Sonny.
Thanks, Hi. Dani's already introduced me, which takes away the start of my talk, which is... But that's fine. It's still fine. Yeah, so I'm Sonny. I'm an autistic counsellor, and I mostly work with neurodivergent and queer folks in Edinburgh. And I kind of have an admission that I'd like to start with. This is a safe space, I think, right? I don't know what a counsellor is. So in kind of typical counsellor fashion, let's unpack that a little bit. So growing up, I really struggled with titles of things, you know, with different job titles. So I didn't really know what a teacher is. I would go at the end of class to my English teacher and give her a sort of feedback of how I thought the lesson went. And I got a report from my form tutor where apparently she asked him what was wrong with me. I also used to talk to my deputy head apparently as if she was an equal, which was apparently not okay. And yeah, so kind of over time, I really struggled with this kind of expectation of how I was supposed to communicate with people, how I'm supposed to sort of talk to people based on their job titles. And as I grew up, as I became an adult, that continued. So I didn't really know how to be a university student. I didn't really know how to be an employee. I think I was working at a design place and the boss asked me if I could do him a favor, and I said, it depends. And there was an intake of breath throughout the whole office. And I didn't understand why. And my kind of mentor at the office took me aside and said, you must never say that. So, you know, kind of not really knowing what expectations are related to job titles is something that I think maybe, you know, if you're also autistic in the audience, you might or might not relate to a little bit. And this is something that I think can really impact people when they go to therapy. So I did some research a couple of years back now on autistic people's experiences of talk therapies. You can find that on autisticmentalhealth.uk. And what we found in that research was really interesting. A lot of autistic people said that they were told that they weren't engaging, even though they were working really hard to engage. They were told that they weren't doing counselling right, or they felt like they were doing counselling wrong, that they didn't know how to do the language of therapy. Sometimes therapists that we spoke with said that working with autistic people didn't feel like therapy. Or that, and this refers to an earlier piece of research that I did with AMAZE on access to mental health services, that autistic people seem too complicated to treat. So what conclusions can we take from this, given, you know, my general confusion about what counselling is, and seemingly autistic people not doing counselling right? I mean, maybe we shouldn't do counselling. Maybe counselling's just not right for autistic people. Maybe we should be denied counselling. I think you can probably tell that's not the conclusion I'm going to go for here. Otherwise, I'm in trouble, you know, as a counsellor, working with autistic and other neurodivergent people. I wonder if the other conclusion we could come to is something more about the sort of normative ideas of what counselling is. Is it possible? Is it possible that counselling is overly rigid in its ideas of what counselling should be and what's right or wrong? Could it be possible that counselling is given to black and white thinking about whether therapy is good or bad, like what kinds of therapy is good or bad? Could there be an over-attachment to rituals or particular ways of doing counselling? And also, maybe there are some restricted interests in there. Maybe counselling is overly interested in certain topics or certain ways of communicating. By the way, I wrote this at 4 a.m. in my head this morning, and I've no idea how long it's going to take, but I won't go over, but oh gosh, that's quite good actually, 15 minutes. So, because I don't know what a therapist is, I don't know what a counselor is, I realized that, all of these questions around expectations, right? I realized that I couldn't really go with these expectations. I had to kind of figure it out myself. I had to figure out, what counseling is for me. So let's break down the kind of questions I've got just now. Like, you can kind of hear where I was going with the rigid thinking and black and white stuff, I hope. So one of the things I learned, I kind of thought I knew going into training, was therapists are supposed to be empathetic. What I realized as I got into training was actually one of the biggest things that trainees needed to unlearn was that we're empathetic. We're actually all getting it wrong all the time. And the most dangerous thing is if somebody is deeply attached to the idea that they're empathetic, because that's when they're most likely to not notice when they're not, or to feel attacked when they realize they're falling short. If we are able to embrace being wrong, if we're able to embrace the idea that being empathetic is a continuous process of work, then we might be able to notice and check constantly. So one of the things that I found really liberating in my counseling training was realizing that actually empathy was about checking. It was about going, you made a face there, what was that about? Appropriate tone depending on what's going on, or not appropriate tone, I don't know. But it was about kind of not assuming that I knew what the other person was feeling. And incidentally, I'm going to say this, but even though it might revoke my autism card, but I did get I got a comment from a tutor somewhere that I should frame that said, displays advanced empathy, which is a thing that you can display in counseling training, apparently, that you're supposed to display in counseling training. What's really interesting, actually, about that, and this is an aside, is that one of the things that's really important in therapy is that not only that counseling, congruence, warmth, all of those things are put forward by the practitioner, it's that they're received by the person coming to therapy. So in many cases, if the individual is not receiving the warmth, they're not receiving the understanding, then there's still a problem. We really need to make it clear when we're trying to understand. And I think part of the work of making it clear that we're trying to understand is what people sometimes experience as true empathy, as somebody really working hard to try and be in our frame of reference, to try and be with us in this process. Looking at the time again. But so, let's think about correct ways of doing therapy. I wonder what all of you picture when you kind of picture a therapy situation. I'm expecting maybe it's like 2 chairs, people sitting there. Maybe there's a cheese plant in the corner, there's a clock, there's some tissues. It's in a room. Why? Why is it in a room? Why is it chairs facing each other? Why is it 50 minutes or an hour? Or, it's usually 50 minutes in a lot of frames of therapy. Why is it speaking? One of the most powerful experiences I've had as a client of being in therapy was during a period when I was non-speaking. And I sat in the room and we drew pictures on the floor on a big piece of paper. And I just drew pictures of plants and bugs I saw that day. But it was a really connecting moment. It was a moment where I knew that it was okay just to be me, that I wasn't failing as a client, that I could just sit and have that relationship and that communication with my counselor. sometimes my approach is person-centered, which to me means that it's about the relationship. It's about the connection I have with the person that I'm working with. It's about the collaboration. One of the things that came up in our research was that sometimes non-directivity, which is a big part of person-centered therapy, and kind of using silence, was really stressful for a lot of people. And that's led to, I think, a lot of people understandably going, oh, I really don't like non-directive therapy. I don't like silence. And that's really, really understandable. I think one of the reasons for that is because therapists sometimes settle into a norm where they think that this is comfortable. I'm comfortable with the silence, so you must be. I like to use an analogy where in order to have a space that you're inviting someone into, it's a bit like kind of you're sitting in front of a fire and there's a log. Like, imagine how you would invite someone to sit next to you to enjoy the fire. I'd kind of imagine that you would probably you'd move aside on the log and you'd be like, this fire's really lovely. Do you want to warm your hands on it as well? Rather than kind of like hiding in the bushes and being like, are they going to sit on the log? And I think that kind of non-directivity, that invitation, is an active way of inhabiting the space. Non-directivity is not about being just kind of like a lump, right? It's not about being passive. It's about actively being a part of the relationship. Routines around counseling. I sort of talked a little bit about kind of, the room, chairs. A lot of people in our research talked about how sometimes it was really stressful having chairs opposite each other because you're staring eyeball to eyeball. I find it stressful. I like to have chairs at 90 degrees, or I like to be walking in a wood where we're side by side, or I like to be sharing attention by like looking at a piece of paper or playing with some fidget toys or playing with some Lego. And that's another example as well that the therapist's needs are important as well, but we need to own that they are our needs, because otherwise they become just the secret established norms of what the space is about. It becomes like, this is my space, and these are the rules of therapy, rather than, this is a negotiation. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about where we want the chairs to be. Let's talk about how we want the room to be. Let's talk about if we go outside. Opening up that negotiation, opening up that space so that we can all, the people in the relationship can collaborate, I think is a starting point for actually looking at different ways that we can do counselling. And of course, a bit like kind of what Fergus and the other two people in the panel, in the education talk we're talking about, it's about flexibility. It's about being able to respond to individual needs while owning your own, while knowing what you need to do to be in the space it's access. Something else I kind of quite like to talk about is communication. So I feel like in therapy there is quite often a norm when it comes to communication. A lot of people think about therapy as being, we go there to talk about our feelings. We have like phrases like, let's unpack that, or how does that make you feel? I don't use those, by the way, and I have a sort of strong allergic reaction to using those phrases, which is not entirely fair, but I think that sometimes if we assume that therapy is about using the language of therapy, using the language of emotions, we are excluding a lot of people from being able to access the space. We're saying, this is the only language that is acceptable here. I like to use a sort of a foraging analogy because I like to be in the woods looking for plants. It's a little bit like somebody walks through the woods. I don't know how well you know your plants, but somebody goes, oh, that's, damn it, I don't actually know the Latin names of things, but they go, oh, that's garlic mustard. And the other person goes, I don't know what that is. You have to use the Latin name, otherwise I do not recognize it. And I mean, there's uses for all of these different ways of describing the same things. But we need to be able to expand our vocabularies. We need to be open to talking about things in different ways. I really like to use images, and I know that doesn't work for all neurodivergent people, but I quite like to use images and analogies in my work. So rather than talking about emotion, rather than talking about anxiety, for example, we might talk about the scene around us. So a tangled wood might be the feeling that's inside at the moment. Or we might use physical feelings. So it might be like, I feel like I'm full of bees, or I feel like everything inside is really tight. And then we can start playing with that analogy. We can say, well, what are the bees doing? Where do they need to go? What part of the body is the tightness in? It becomes more of a sort of very sensory exploration. And that kind of takes me in the last 5 minutes to the sort of topics that counselling tends to focus on in sort of normative ideas around counselling. Quite often, when we talk about counselling, it's kind of, there's this idea that people go when they need help with, like, usually depression and anxiety. It's said in one word, right? Or like people are sent to counselling to deal with their autism or deal with their ADHD. And it becomes very focused on the idea that there is something wrong that needs to be fixed. To me, counselling is a process in which we can explore who we are and how we exist in the world around us. And I read a great thread recently that I'm going to totally rip off about, what it means when you're in a minority and you're in counselling and you're told that the way to get better, the way to be healthy, is when you feel healthy is when you feel comfortable with society, when you get over your trauma. What happens if the trauma is ongoing? What happens if you are neurodivergent in neurotypical society? What happens if you are trans in cisnormative society? What happens if you're a person of color in white society? So, it's really important that we recognize when people have minority experiences that are ongoing. And I think for me, when it comes to neurodiversity brings a challenge to this. It says, look, there are many different ways of being, and we have an assumption that there is only one way that's right and healthy. How do we exist if we're different? How do we exist if we're in the minority? How can we find moments of joy amongst the pain? How can we find moments of feeling calm and okay, or have moments to ourselves? I think it's really important to kind of grab onto, to maybe like not worry so much about the words that tend to be thrown around with mental health, like independence, resilience. What about things like interdependence, finding our community, finding ways to rely on each other? What about realizing that the ways that we respond, even things like dissociation, like panic attacks, like meltdowns, are ways that we naturally respond to protect ourselves? How can we find ways to be okay with that, or okay enough within the world that we're in? And I'm taking a bit from that thread now, which I will share on Twitter. But it's about finding ways to connect with each other and love and fight together. And I think that's really important. So one of the things that I do, I'm going to say this sort of quickly, is quite often with neurodivergent people is we look at our sensory worlds quite a lot. Because I think that a lot of people as kids, we knew what we needed. And then it was kind of, if not beaten out of us, then certainly sort of invalidated out of us. And it's about kind of going back to that, going back to saying, I really like the way the light is dancing on the table. What kind of things do you like to look at? What kinds of things hypnotize you? What kind of things pull you in a really satisfying bodily way? And reclaiming some of that, reclaiming that space for ourselves and finding that autistic or neurodivergent joy and just being able to own that for a moment. And that's the other thing, is that I think joy isn't talked about enough in therapy. Being able to find joy, being able to find a moment of being right in ourselves. When I'm going to sort of round off with sort of some of the things that came out of the research of experiences of talk therapies. So when we asked people what they wanted from therapy, they said they wanted to be validated. They wanted to be believed. They wanted professionals to not dismiss their experiences. They wanted the counselling space to be accessible. I feel horrible saying this is what we need to do for autistic people because this is basic. This is basic for counselling. This is what somebody needs to access any service. So I think that what neurodiversity as a paradigm does is it challenges us to expand our imaginations and our understandings so that if a population is saying, we're not being validated in this space, we're not able to access it, we need to expand what we mean by counselling. When I first realized that I didn't know what counselling was, I was a bit worried because I was like, oh crap, I'm a counsellor and I don't know what counselling is, or I don't know what being a counsellor is. And I spent quite a long time journaling and thinking about it. And because I sort of felt like I had a sense that I wasn't worried about what my role was. For me, I realized that what's important to me is what I feel my responsibilities are in that relationship. And also what my expectations are that I can verbalize and share with the other person in the relationship, and they could share their expectations with me, and we could come to some understanding. I think that is essential for all relationships between people, but particularly between neurodivergent people and, well, particularly more neurotypical people could do to kind of do that a little bit more with people who are different. A lot more, actually. So I think that's kind of where I'm going to end, actually. I didn't really I think I had a snappy ending, but it's gone.
So much, Sonny. That was a really, really thought-provoking presentation that you shared with us. I'm sure there's lots of questions coming through already about it. So our next speaker is Dr. Dinah Aitken, and she is a member of the Salveston Mind Room, and her primary role is responsible for outreach. Is that right? Within the organization. So she's going to be coming to talk to us about homeschooling and insights into parents and teachers in partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello. Yes, as advertised, I'm Dinah Aitken, and I'm Head of Outreach at Mind Room. So I've been at Mind Room for about 6.5 years, and it's been an absolute privilege to work in this organisation. And I particularly value the insights that I and our whole team get every day from the children and young people and the parents and carers that we support. From these daily conversations, we've got a deep understanding of the lives of neurodivergent individuals and their families, and I want to share some of those experiences with you now. So I'm focusing on homeschool partnerships, and just for context, I wanted to mention the policy framework for this here in Scotland. So we have legislation which is the Parental Involvement and Engagement Act, and that requires schools to engage with parents and carers. They have to report on performance of this through various means, such as self-assessment processes. So involvement is deemed to be about the life of the school, like the parent council, fundraising, maybe supporting pupils going on trips and so on. And engagement is more about children's learning. And the driver for this is the evidential basis that says that children whose families are more engaged in their learning will achieve better outcomes. And this in turn is geared towards the Scottish Government high-level policy to reduce the poverty-related attainment gap. But whether you tag this as involvement or engagement or partnership, it all has personal relationships at the heart. And thinking about language, I wanted to say that it's important to make sure that we all bring the same understanding of language, of the language we use. And the overarching title of this topic session is Professional Relationships. So I want just to spend a moment thinking about what that might mean to us all. So, of course, just having a clicker moment here. Haha. So, of course, schools are full of paid professionals, such as teachers and support staff, allied health professionals, educational psychologists, and the like, all highly skilled, all well-trained, all expert in their field. But we need to also acknowledge that parents and carers are experts in knowing their own child. And, of course, children and young people are also expert in knowing what they need, although for some, they might need help to explore that or to express their views. So another way of looking at the virtuous circle is to identify everyone involved in the relationships that underpin homeschool partnerships: school staff, parents and carers, and children and young people. And the most successful homeschool partnerships will give equal weight to everyone in the circle and seek to make communication a three-way process. So I'd like to play for you now a short audio clip from one of the parents that we've supported. The words belong to the parent, and they're read for us by one of our team. Every family that we support is unique, but there are common threads, and the story you will hear now is one that will resonate with many parents and carers of neurodivergent children. So, here we go.
For me, a breakdown in communication with the school led to real illness and burnout in the family, and specifically on me. I often feel like I am communicating with the school too much, that when I call the school or email, they roll their eyes and think it's Mrs. X again. A parent's voice isn't always welcome, which means my child's voice not being heard. My autistic daughter is currently in P5 and requires an adapted timetable, and is now consistently attending 4 days a week with a day off as her rest day. As a parent, you are building up trust and thinking what has been put in place is working for your child, and then there can be one person, one meeting which changes everything. Changes being made without involvement from the parent can feel like the rug being pulled from a parent. You are the one at the end of the day picking up the pieces. You cannot explore these changes with your child, and you feel like you are letting your child down at the same time. This experience led to me feeling like my child was nothing. Not having open dialogue and communication was very difficult to give a real insight to who my daughter actually is. I drop my child later and pick her up earlier because of her needs. I don't get to interact with other parents, so interactions with staff are really important. This had a direct impact on my own mental health and the feeling of isolation. My daughter is very intuitive and picks up tensions and how I'm feeling too. As a parent of 3 neurodivergent children, my parental commitments are never ending. One day I could be at a physio appointment, medical appointment, genetic appointment and school meeting. Then, amongst these, I have phone calls with occupational therapy and social work. I don't think school account or realise how much goes on in one day. When a meeting is scheduled and it doesn't go to plan, how disheartening that can be, because your time is not accounted for. Bad communication with school is impacting my child, as things happening on her off day aren't being communicated home. My daughter missed out on school photos, events with her peers and other activities. The negative effect of missing out time with her peers is shown at home through her not sleeping, gritting her teeth and not wanting to go to school the next day. The feeling of not being included had the most detrimental effect, where if this was communicated, we could have changed her off day so that she was included. I'm pleased to say that communication with school has improved. My daughter now has her own advocate, which has supported her to express her views. I hope that parents of neurodivergent children can just be respected and be offered the opportunity to showcase their expertise about their own child. Because we are all working together for one goal, a happy and thriving child, regardless of their needs.
So as this parent has really vibrantly told us, a poor relationship with school impacts on mental health and well-being throughout the family. And missed or poorly managed communication can lead to heightened anxiety for the child to the point that they feel so bad that they can't attend school. And the burden on schools, too, is well known. We ask a lot of our teachers against a background of depleting local authority budgets and growing levels of anxiety among students, especially post-pandemic. But I think that clip has given us a clear insight into the need to understand the complexity of family life for those families supporting children who are neurodivergent. It's not said here, but we know that for a great number of families, it's impossible to gain and keep decently paid full-time employment when you have endless medical and legal appointments to juggle. Or every day ends with a distraught child who struggles to let you know why they are so distressed. However, it is important to say that schools do work hard to avoid these stressful situations. We know in Mindroom that schools and school staff across the country are doing a fantastic job to support the children in their daily care. So I'd like to play another clip, also scripted by a parent we've supported and read by one of our team, that shows how a school can get it right and help the parent and child to feel listened to and valued. In this clip, you'll hear the parent reference SMC, and that is Salveson Mindroom Centre, just to let you know what that acronym is for. So here's our second parent.
I have had both good and challenging experiences with communication with professionals. I'd like to focus on a positive relationship and communication and what impact this has had on me, my family and my son. My son is 9 years old, is autistic and has a diagnosis of ADHD. My day-to-day schedule revolves around my son and his needs, which means communicating with a lot of professionals. This can often feel overwhelming, so this is why having good communication between home and school can really help reduce anxieties. I felt lucky with the communication and relationship with my son's current school, but I do think having support from SMC has really helped establish a good basis of positive communication. SMC has helped talk through some suggestions, like a communication diary, which I would not have known or thought about. With a child like mine, who doesn't say anything when he gets home from school, when there is no communication, or there are challenges with communication with school, it makes it very difficult for a parent. School communication is important because it helps with building trust. It means that both school and home can be on the same page. For example, my son struggles with his emotions. By sharing that school was working on emotional regulation, and at home we were too, we were able to create consistency and use the same strategies. There were times when the communication diary was inconsistent, and this made me feel really anxious. It made me question if school knew how to support my son or really recognised his needs. If you don't know what is going on and you hear nothing from school or your child, you're left in the dark. My son's school day can really impact how he is in the afternoons or evenings. Having no indication what may have led to this is really difficult. Your son is unable to tell you, your school has not told you anything, but you are the one there picking up the pieces. When the communication diary is consistent, it really helps. I completely understand the constraints of school staff and a busy school day, but just knowing who you can contact and how makes a huge difference. For our situation, I have a daily communication diary which gives us snippets of my son's day. I have a key contact who I know I can email or who will email me if there is anything additional which cannot be put in the diary. And we have regular child planning meetings. Due to my son's needs, he gets a taxi to and from school, which means I don't have many occasions to meet with school staff or other parents face to face, and it can feel isolating. At least knowing there is a system in place to communicate between school and home is a weight lifted. When there is a new member of staff involved, what is helpful is being involved in the process. When you're not given the right information, it doesn't feel like you are valued by the professionals. Knowledge and awareness can help us parents to feel part of the decision making and make the right decisions which suit my child's needs. When you're stressed about a lot of other things in your day-to-day life of supporting a neurodivergent child, it makes a huge difference to the overall parent's day to just feel comfortable and reassured about their communication with school. You can only know what is really going on with talking and listening, and the parent having a channel to communicate information to school. I hope it's been helpful for more parents of neurodivergent children by talking about this positive experience and highlighting the small things that can really support good communication between school and home.
So we often recommend a homeschool diary as a communication tool that will work for home and school, and that's worked well for this family, as you've just heard. We also often recommend discussing strategies that home and school can mirror to provide consistency for the children. Schools are usually very willing and receptive to these suggestions, but to drive forward change, we'd like to see these kinds of approaches as standard and not something that parents need to fight for. And that's the kind of systems change that Mindroom exists to advocate for. And we're really grateful to these two families here who've shared their experience today. But how do we get to that place where homeschool partnerships work more smoothly from the off? The audio clips have outlined the value of homeschool diaries and shared strategies, as well as inclusive practices and a reminder to share information in advance to allow for pre-planning. Avoiding sudden unexplained changes, such as a change of key staff, will help. Of course, there are times when a teacher becomes unavailable at short notice, but there's more often plenty of time to signal a change coming up, giving the family time to prepare their child in advance. And being creative about inclusion will make a huge difference. Thinking of those parents who are isolated and not able to meet other families, or those children on part-time timetables who might miss key rites of passage events. With the use of technology and pre-planning, there are ways to reach those families too, so that they feel fully included in school life. As we recognised at the start, the child at school is a key partner in homeschool relationships, and I would like to emphasise the value of having an independent advocate. This is especially true for neurodivergent children who may be non-speaking, and having an independent person that is trusted to help the child to express their views can be absolutely transformative. I would add, from a family perspective, it's essential that they feel the school knows and understands their child. Those situations where it seems like the school is describing someone else's child leaves parents cold, and it doesn't help to form trusting relationships. A simple pupil passport system, complete with the photograph of the pupil that's shared with key school personnel, often works well to help ensure a personalised approach. And finally, because so much about homeschool partnerships can turn on child planning meetings, the way that school meetings are approached and carried out is vitally important. There are practical elements to in-school meetings that can become routine good practice, and a few of those are listed here. For example, ensuring that all the participants are named in advance and the reason why they're attending is understood through their role being clearly explained. Agendas and minutes are important, but equally important are that promises are kept by all parties. Actions should be agreed and they should be carried through in a timely fashion. And it's important to communicate that these actions have occurred. We often hear from families who are concerned that there has been inaction, but when we check in with the school, we find that plenty has been going on. It's just not being communicated to the family. The other aspect of these meetings is their emotional import for everyone involved. Parents may wait anxiously for a meeting with feelings of high expectations or sometimes dread. Schools might feel that they can't meet the expectations and that the parent will never be satisfied. A third-party facilitator or someone like a Mindroom outreach worker in a support role can help to reduce the conflict and take the heat out of the situation. By recognising that meetings can be emotional events, but that the common purpose is the well-being of the child in the centre, it's often possible to find the common ground where everyone can stand and move forward from that point together. So, to sum up, the key ingredients for a successful home-school partnership. We need everyone included in an atmosphere of mutual respect. We need to deploy active listening, where we don't just go through the motions and we really try to make the other person feel heard. We need to be willing to compromise and be flexible. We need to never forget the central importance of the child or the young person's voice. And it's important to bring an empathetic approach to every interaction, recognising the humanity of all the partners involved. Transparency is vital too, to ensure that relationships are built on trust and all partners understand one another and can communicate openly and honestly. And we need to communicate accessibly in a way that works for the individuals involved, whatever that might mean. This may sound fairly obvious and straightforward, and schools that recognise the centrality of relationships will have these processes already in place that are leading in the right direction. But remembering that every family is unique, if I had to take just one of these elements to the famous desert island, I'd probably go for active listening. The Mindroom experience is very much that ensuring that parents and carers feel heard is absolutely central to building effective relationships that will in turn support sustainable home-school partnerships. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dinah. That was amazing. Okay, very, very well timed. We have some questions here coming through. So far, they've started off kind of with some coming through for Sonny to begin with. I think there's might be a few more coming through for Dinah in a moment. Shall we start with the ones that have come through for you, Sonny?
Yeah, that's
All right.
Should I stay here?
Yeah, where are you most comfortable standing?
Happy here.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the one is this going to go off and beep in a minute, or just?
It'll just go orange.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Right. So do you have any tips for finding a suitable counsellor or therapist who is autistic if many do not disclose that they are autistic?
That's a really good question. So there are certainly listings of neurodivergent therapists. So ANDT is an organisation whose acronym I can never remember what it stands for. Neurodivergent therapists. That one. And they do have a, unfortunately, slightly small list, but a good list of neurodivergent therapists. It's kind of worth saying that it's not just about the person being neurodivergent. They need to be a good fit for you as well. So for me, I tend to go, personally, with therapists who feel like they're a bit rough around the edges in a kind of messy way, not too slick, maybe quite open to being flexible. So my current therapist, we had an initial chat and we just talked on the phone for like 2 hours and it was very nice. And then now we walk in the woods. So I think finding therapists where you could ask, you might feel comfortable asking them about what you would like, the session to look like. And if they respond in a very defensive or weird way, then maybe that's not a good fit for you. Whereas if they sound very open to it, to a conversation, then that could be somewhere to go from. I hope that's kind of the best advice I can give at this point, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and this is another one for Sonny. How could counselling training better prepare trainee counsellors for working with neurodivergent people beyond awareness? Sounds like a big one.
Yeah, so I have a massive bee in my bonnet about training. I think currently counselling training is really, really bad at dealing with diversity in general. Generally, you have like a day on each diversity topic, and there isn't a recognition. Like, so one of the courses I did, it talked about working with difference, and it was always the assumption that the other person would be the one that was different. And I think that makes it very challenging for therapists who are neurodivergent themselves or different themselves, and it's also just, it's not great. So, yeah, training, I think, needs to focus on having diversity throughout the whole course. And I don't really, when I do counsellor training, I don't like to sort of tell people what do you do with an autistic person, or what do you do with an ADHD person. I prefer to get people to start thinking about neurodiversity and their place in it. So I get people to start really like shifting their understanding of themselves. There's one thing that we talk about in person-centered therapy is that the professional and the personal are very, very tightly melded. They're the same thing. And when you are a counsellor, you are changed by the relationship along with the person that you're working with. And I've been changed by everyone that I've worked with. And I think that if you are prepared to be changed by the training on a very personal, deep level, then you are embracing diversity in a more meaningful way than just ticking a bunch of, like, I have learnt this about autism, which I think is actually really deeply problematic.
Very good answer. Thank you. All right, this one's for Dinah. How can a parent improve relationship with a school when they're experiencing silencing and defensiveness from the school?
Yeah, I think that's very difficult for parents, and it's not at all uncommon. Often when parents get to that point, it's after quite a long period of feeling that they're, having to ask questions and fight for their child's rights, which is often a phrase that we hear. And it's quite hard then to take a step back and be a bit more dispassionate, as I was saying, just to try and take the heat out of the situation, and help shift the school. I mean, this is why I was saying it's a circular thing. It's not professionals up here and parents and carers and the children and young people out here. Everyone's in this circle together. So it can be very helpful. I mean, this is not a punt for Mindroom for business, but it can be very helpful to have a third party, a supporter who can help mediate those conversations and just make them a little bit more objective. I think that helps the school as well step back from that defensive position that they've taken, because sometimes the schools can find it quite hard to back down from that stance. So yeah, seeking a bit of external help, I think, can be a good thing, just to help oil the wheels.
Okay, and I do wonder if it might be, there's a follow-on question that I think might be related to kind of what you've just said, so I'll just say it and you might be able to tie it in with what you've just answered. But do you have any advice for parents who struggle to communicate with schools due to social anxiety themselves? So.
Yeah, I think similarly, it might be worth getting a bit of support with that. I think there's a job for schools to do. Before I came along to give this talk, I thought, well, I'll just see what the communication channels for parents are with schools. And I went to the websites, first of all, obvious place to start. And there was such a variation there. Some of the websites were easy to navigate. They had a lot of information for parents. It was obvious, what they were offering and what path you should go down. Others, it was just a minefield, and you ended up on the local authority webpage, which is always a horrible experience. So I think schools could take on a bit more responsibility for that, for being more open, having different channels of communication that people can use. I mean, there is, I think I'm one of the last people in Scotland that remembers there are accessibility strategies, there's legislation around that, and actually accessible communication is one of the strands of an accessibility strategy which every local authority should have and should fulfil.
That's a really good point, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so sorry, there's quite a few questions popping in. I'm trying to kind of collate them. For Sonny, how do you find the experience of counsellor training, and did you find your tutors were positive and supportive towards your ways of working and thinking?
I'm doing a face at this, and let's unpack that face, shall we? My certificate training was great. It was honestly life-changing for me, and that doesn't mean that all certificate courses will be life-changing for all people. I was very lucky. I felt like I finally felt safe to be myself around people. And as a counsellor now, it's the one space where I feel most myself. I'm sort of more myself all the time now. My diploma was a very different story, and I knew that the diploma would be hard. I knew that a lot of, not just autistic people, neurodivergent people, disabled people, queer folks, I know that a lot of us struggle through counsellor training, like massively. So I chose the only course I could afford that I also knew I would survive because it was short. And it was an experiential course, which is what I wanted, more kind of actual doing counselling rather than kind of writing essays. It was person-centered with a lot of other modalities in there that I could learn about. But it was really hard. It was a challenge, and I think it gave me an idea, because I went into counselling training to find out what was going wrong, and I got my answer. And it was that there is a real resistance to difference, and that's a really painful thing to have to say. So there does need to be a lot of change. I've forgotten what the question was, but I think I answered it.
I think so too. No, that was really helpful. Okay, great. Dinah, so in terms of, I guess, the school-home relationship, there's a question here about saying that autistic children might have issues with kind of abuse at home as well, and how do you, what do you think kind of can help to if there's this suspect homeschooling kind of parent abuse going on, and kind of how that affects the relationship going on, the dynamic that you're trying to build to support the child. So it's quite a tricky one.
That's quite a difficult question. I think I'm going to.
Do you want a moment to think about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say it's that's kind of, you've been trying to.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's just see what other ones we haven't come across. I think we've got most of the ones up here. There's this one about how well do you, for Sonny, how do you approach the person-centered reluctance to diagnosis when working with neurodivergent populations, where diagnosis holds so much weight?
That's interesting. I would be interested to know. I can definitely see that there are practitioners I know practitioners who are against diagnosis, and I think it's because they don't understand what these identities mean to us as neurodivergent people. And usually it takes a while, but if I manage to communicate that to them, they're like, oh, okay, I see that this is not just a thing that you've labeled yourself as to limit yourself. And I wouldn't say it was a specifically person-centered thing, but I think that some person-centered practitioners maybe misunderstand that in order to see the individual, you do still have to see the individual in systems. You don't take the individual out and go, here is a person, they do not exist in society. And in a way, that's why I'm such a fan of not always working in the room, because we don't stay in a counselling room all our lives, right? We go into parks and we go into I don't know, cafes and all kinds of places. So recognizing that the individual exists within a community which may or may not accept them is really important. So I know I kind of deviated a bit from the question, but I think that is my challenge generally when I speak with person-centered people who say, oh, I don't need to learn about this, or why are diagnostic labels important, is I say you do need to learn about this, and this is why. And it's about the context of power and normativity and all of that, which, yeah, like people who are more neurotypical or at least don't realize that they're neurodivergent might miss sometimes.
Right. Yeah, we just have, this will have to be a last one, I think, and then
Okay, just so to answer the question about a concern that there might be an abuse situation at home. I mean, obviously, schools have got legal duties to safeguard the children that are coming into their care every day. And that's another reason for trying to build good home-school relationships, because it's only by getting to know the family situation that the children are coming from that the school can respond to it sensitively. You know, whether that is the more typical situation that I might have been describing earlier, where the child is needing support and the family's feeling a bit isolated, but equally to detect, I suppose, those situations where there are other concerns relating to the child, which will mean that the school is going to have to bring in its safeguarding duties. I mean, in our situation, we sometimes have concerns about some of the children that we hear about through our work, and we do try to work with the family to let them know that we have a concern and that, you know, we may have to breach confidentiality, and that's the type of step that the school is going to have to take in that sort of situation too.
Okay. Thank you very much. Could we just show our appreciations to our speakers? It was a really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it a lot. So thank you all. Okay, bye.